With no comments, I'll accept a motion to approve the agenda. Is there a second? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Abstentions, motion carries. Are there any comments on the minutes from September 27th, 2022? Hearing none, I'll accept a motion to approve the minutes from September 27th, 2022. The first from Paul, is there a second?
Second.
Second. All in favor, say aye. Opposed, say nay.
Aye.
Abstentions, motion carries. Thank you. And then Lori or NJ, any public comments submitted tonight?
No public comment submitted for this meeting.
Great. All right, I'll turn it over to Lori Oliver Joseph for project update.
Okay, great. Well, thank you all and good evening. Thank you to all our committee members who are here tonight and our agency partners as well. We appreciate your commitment to being part of this project very much. So just a quick overview. So we held our first 50-year plan stakeholder advisory committee this year in March. We've held 8 meetings to date, with tonight's meeting being the 9th. Let's see, we first kicked off the project with a focus on community involvement. So we did the community conversation kits, the vision survey, and we also had a really good time at the annual town meeting where we had a breakout group session to get feedback on what citizens want to protect, where future development might occur, and what amenities folks might want to see in the future. And then in April, the housing needs analysis portion of the study was started. And then this committee reviewed that final draft of that document in the end of September. And so our next topic, which we're going to go over tonight, is going to be the draft economic opportunities analysis. And tonight we invited members of the Economic Development Committee to join us as well and provide feedback on that draft. And then throughout the project, we've also engaged in community outreach activities, like at the farmers market and Adventure Fest, and again at the annual town meeting. And then after the presentation tonight, Beth will just go over kind of next steps for our project. And so again, I just appreciate you all very much for being here and for participating in our project.
Thank you.
I have one last thing, if that would be all right. I just wanted to let everyone know that NJ is now the associate planner for the city of Scappoose. He was previously serving as the intern in the planning department. So congratulations to NJ.
Thank you, Lori. It's good to be here.
And that was the position you had prior to the community development director?
Well, first I was the associate planner, then I was the city planner, then I was the planning department supervisor, and now I'm the community development director.
Okay.
I'm busy 8 years.
At one point. All right. Congratulations, NJ. It's awesome to have you permanently. Great, thank you. So let's hand it over to Beth and Brittany.
Okay. So what I propose that we do first is we go through this PowerPoint that we've got that recaps the analysis and the economic opportunities analysis, and we'll end eventually in a discussion of policies. Before we get to that discussion of policies, if there's any comments on the EOA report itself, the economic opportunities report itself, obviously we'd like to hear those comments. If there are comments that are topographical errors, that kind of typographical, not topographical, that would be interesting. Then can I ask that you guys send those to NJ or Laurie, and we'll of course get them addressed, but rather than taking time here. And if you have comments as we go on, of course we want to hear that as we go on. I'm hoping that the second half of the meeting will be a discussion of policy, economic development policy. So does that sound okay to everybody? All right. So here we have our schedule, and this is mostly a schedule of what we've done this year. So here we're finishing up the draft
Excuse me,
economic.
Beth, 1 second. Do we
Sorry.
have a printout of the slide? No. We, right. Did everyone get one?
I think NJ's bringing one around.
Everyone except for me. I think I think picked one up. Thank you, NJ. Sorry, Beth.
No worries. So here we're finishing up with the economic opportunities analysis, and we've got a decision maker work session in December to talk about where we have been and where we are and where we'll be going. In 2023, we'll be coming back to you early in the year to talk about other land needs. And so that's land needs other than housing or employment land. So things like parkland, land for churches, those kind of things, land for public facilities, all of that. We'll be bringing that back to you. And once we have all of those pieces together and the 50-year forecasts together, then we can start talking about what do we do about UGB issues, which we might have the beginnings of discussion in January. I'm not positive of that, so I don't want to commit to that for sure, because we need to see when we get some of the information that we need to be able to do the other land needs discussion. We'll also be bringing back the vision statement with changes based on additional feedback that we had with some conversations with Latino population, Spanish-speaking population, as well as any input from the farmers market and the Fun Fest. We are planning on our part of the next all town meeting to be, or annual town meeting, to be focusing on some of these land needs that we've been talking about and starting to talk about some of the policies for the comprehensive plan. So I'm sure we'll have fun stuff for that meeting. Not that we've talked to Laurie about any of that, but we will. So that's where we'll be going. And of course, in 2023, we'll be talking about the urban growth boundary in a lot more detail. And I think you guys will get tired of talking about that eventually. So there's our agenda for what we're hoping to cover here today. And so to recap, we had a minor update to the buildable lands inventory where we just had a small error that we fixed with one of the constraints, I believe. So we're looking at a little different numbers than we talked about before, but it's not a major difference. What you've got is 489 acres of land inside the city limits for commercial and industrial sorts of uses. A lot of that is at the airport. And you can see on the right-hand side of this slide that a lot of that land, 253 acres, is in the East Airport Employment Overlay Zone, with about 49 acres in the industrial park and 37 in the business park. And we'll be talking more about some of those in a few minutes. So you can see that the results of the buildable lands inventory didn't change much. So just reviewing again the uses allowed in your different zoning districts. I'm not actually sure we presented this before, but these are a summary. You've got very long zoning chapters or zoning sections about each of these, and these are a summary of the kinds of uses. So there's more uses that are allowed in some of your zoning districts. So in commercial, you've got things like mixed use and retail and personal services, churches, schools, that kind of thing. Your EC zone also allows a certain amount of light industrial type things like packaging, mini storage, equipment sales and rental, that kind of thing. Your light industrial allows manufacturing, obviously, packaging and processing of materials, transportation terminals and storage, wholesale, that kind of thing, with a little bit of limited retail, those kind of things. Your airport overlays, I think, are the interesting one. The employment, the EAE, the employment airport area, is really a light industrial sort of use. So it's not limited to things that one could do at an airport. It's a broader industrial use. Your airport industrial area is very similar, but not exactly the same in the types of uses. Again, mostly light industrial sorts of uses, manufacturing, warehouse and distribution. Your airport business park, again, allows those sorts of light industrial and manufacturing uses. It also allows some office uses and personal services. wholesale, medical services, entertainment, education. So it's a little bit of a bridge between your industrial with some amount of commercial uses allowed. And your PUA is really about operations of the airport and aviation related manufacturing or commercial uses. So the PUA is really where you're talking about airport specific uses. So as we go through this, we'll just keep that in mind a little bit, these kind of uses. Any questions or anything I missed, Laurie, before I go on, or NJ?
Brian?
Mentioned this before. It also has uses like hotels, restaurants,
Mm-hmm.
retail. It pretty much has it has light industrial facet to it, but it has pretty much every doing commercial with the exceptions of big box stores and residential stuff. There's maybe a few other things, like I don't know if you have storage there. But I brought this up previously. You guys were going to get back to me. No one.
We're getting back to you today.
Okay. It doesn't seem like that description is complete.
Entertainment, personal services, that kind of thing. That's why I said that it was an abbreviated set of descriptions. And you might,
excuse
I
me,
might remind
Brian?
everybody to talk
Can you
into
guys
the
speak
microphone.
into, thank you.
Yeah, no worries. So Brian was commenting that there's uses in the airport business park that aren't shown.
Yeah. Actually, in 2015, when we did our last analysis, we took a significant amount of our commercial space land that we were allocated. We put it into ABP. So that's why I'm kind of having a little issue here, is because I'm seeing it as it was done as commercial land when it was defined back in the day. Now it's not being presented as commercial land.
We've got it in here at partially as commercial. We may not have as much as you'd like to see.
Okay.
Certainly.
One thing I'd point out too, for the airport business park, so it does list commercial retail as limited because commercial retail, it's 5,000 square feet or less are permitted. And then commercial retail uses between 5,000 and 20,000 square feet require conditional use. So there is that component.
Thank you. I knew there was nuances that we weren't catching here.
Beth, where would heavy industrial be?
You don't really, I mean, you've got a heavy industrial zone, but you don't really have land in that zone.
Yeah, we don't.
And so heavy industrial is going to be things like metal smelting and that kind of thing. And I'm not really sure that's compatible with the kind of things that you might want in Scappoose at this point.
Concrete products. That seems heavy industrial.
So they're still in the county.
Okay, so that's not.
Right. And so even though we have a category, a zoning district, heavy industrial, we don't have any land that's zoned that currently in the city. And then if you look in the annexation chapter, it states that if on the comprehensive plan, a property is designated as industrial, that it will come in under the zoning of light industrial. There's really no mention of heavy industrial. So while there would be an avenue to get there, it's clearly our code is not like outright supporting or proposing that.
Our code allow, let's say down the road, 5-10 years from now, Cascade Concrete, for whatever reason, decide that they would like to be part of our city. Would they be allowed to come in under heavy industrial, or would they?
Yeah, they would request that,
We don't have
and
to change anything to make that.
we don't have to change anything. They would make the request and we would see how it is or is not in conformance with that chapter.
And to a certain degree, I think that there's a little bit of a policy discussion here about the types of industries that Scappoose is wanting. From our discussion in the visioning process, we heard a lot about quality of natural resources, that kind of thing. And so with that, typically, and this doesn't have to be the case, but with that typically goes a focus on uses that are less polluting or non-polluting. And so heavy industrial, I think, is a little bit contrary to that in a lot of cases. Brittany may have a different opinion. Okay, Brittany's agreeing with me. So, but I mean, this is a policy choice. So just because it's not shown here doesn't mean it can't be something to be on the table.
Thank you. Any other questions at this point?
So what zoning is OMIC? Is that light industrial?
Yes.
Unless it's EAE. Is it light
No,
industrial?
that's, no, it's on,
Okay.
it's not near the airport. It's
Okay.
on the other side. Yeah.
It's near the airport. Yeah, relatively.
Okay.
Okay, all right. All right, it's not near the airport. Okay. Mm-hmm. Anything else? All right, so when we look at your buildable land, one of the things we want to make sure that you guys understand is the interaction between number of sites and site sizes. So you've got quite a number of sites that are smaller than 2 acres. Nearly 60% of your sites are smaller than 2 acres. And you can see the dark blue is the airport employment, the teal is industrial, and the yellow is commercial. And so and you've got 4 sites between 10 and 25 acres and 5 sites that are 25 acres and more. So it's easier to break up large sites into smaller sites than it is to aggregate small sites into big sites. So here what we're seeing is the majority of sites, just as a percent of total, are small sites. But when we look at your land, what we see is that 58% of your land is on airport sites and those larger than 25 acres. And so the point here is that that you've got a number of larger sites that are bigger than 25 acres. That means you have a supply that's just a lot different than many communities in the Portland region. And they have obviously a variety of overlays on there. So having those larger sites provides opportunities that you don't have as much in many of the Portland communities. So that's an advantage for the community. Now, are all of those sites, are you going to see, I forget what the largest site size is off the top of my head, but I'll just go with 100 acres. Are you going to see development of a 100-acre site for one use? Maybe, but probably not. Might you see more breakup of a big site like that into some 25-acre sites and maybe a few smaller sites than that? That seems quite probable. So you want to think carefully about how you're using your sites and how you're looking at them. And I feel like Paul might have a comment here because he was coughing. Maybe he was just coughing.
I actually was just coughing.
Okay,
I do have a question if it's not out of order.
certainly.
So industrial sites less than an acre.
Yep.
And I think in terms of city's inventory within its UGB, et cetera, is it actually possible to develop an industrial use on less than an acre with setbacks, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Or would it be, is there some way to reclassify those lands to allow other decisions to?
Well, we wouldn't necessarily, classify them as other than light industrial because they would need to match the comprehensive plan designation. So we wouldn't, a lot of times the location of the site is in a particular area of the city with like uses around it. So we wouldn't, just take little pieces here and there and redesignate and rezone them. But all that to say, light industrial doesn't have huge setback requirements. Um, let's see, front setback, 20 feet, corner lots, side facing the street, 5 feet, through lots, front and rear, 20 feet. And then there's no additional side or rear setback. And as long as it's not abutting a residential district,
Okay.
which usually it's not. And then also there's no minimum lot size. So there's some flexibility there.
Thank you.
Are a lot of the light industrial sites, are they in the same area or are they sporadic? I mean, because you could also combine pieces of land too. If you need if you have like 3 or 4 of them together, you can combine them.
So you can see where the light industrial sites are up on the west of Highway 30 and then a few to the east.
Yeah, so they're generally grouped near one another.
And we're showing zoning here, not comprehensive plan.
Also, that's not all the light industrial zoned property. It's
Yeah.
the unconstrained vacant and partially vacant. So
Yep.
there's additional beyond that. These are just looking at lands that have some potential for development.
Okay, so a recap, where we're looking at is growth of about 2,100 new jobs, the majority of which would be in industrial and then office and commercial services, with a little bit of growth in retail and a little bit of growth in government. Government slides out of here. We take government employment off the table because we're dealing with government employment through the other land uses, because government employment just locates on land very differently than other employment uses, like school employment is on school sites, and that'll be dictated by what the school district is looking at as we talk to them. So then looking down here, when we look at land for industrial uses, we're looking at about 152 acres for industrial uses, and about 48 for commercial and commercial services, and a little bit of, and 6 for retail commercial. And I really squish the retail and the office and commercial services together because they're functionally very similar. Chair Kesey?
Yes, if so, their forecast the next 20 years is about 2,100 jobs.
Mm-hmm.
And how does that relate with our population forecast?
It's a faster forecast than your population forecast.
Okay.
So this is based on historical development, historical job growth in Scappoose. So,
And there's also a lot of opportunity for job growth with the property
Yes.
that we have as well.
and that's part of the reason it makes sense. If you had very little land at this point for commercial and industrial development, I would think, is Scappoose going to grow as much as they did in the past? Because that's more complicated. Getting land into the UGB, as you've seen, getting land into the UGB and serviced and all of that. But you've got that land base, and so it's certainly supportive of at least that amount of growth.
And then how much housing do we need for 2,100 jobs? Are we going to relate that with our housing needs analysis too?
No, we can, but that wasn't something that I had in my head, in part because we're still working at refining parts of the housing needs analysis. So I hadn't stuck my head into that. Not all of the people who work in Scappoose will live in Scappoose because we'll still have some commuting. But we can look at how much housing you'd need for that, which will be different than your forecast of housing.
Okay. Yeah, just something I noticed there. Paul?
Clarity on the airport industrial. On page 50 of the document, it says that the businesses need to be airport related.
And that's for the PUA.
Okay, so it's not the AIP?
Mm-mm.
Okay. The second question is, so the employment density of commercial is 3 times that of industrial. So we're looking to only grow commercial small, less than 20% of, or a little more than 20% of the industrial property. Is there a reason for that, considering that we get 3 times more jobs in commercial? Like, looking at their future employment need,
Yes.
there's only gross acres 48, but if we target more commercial, it's the higher density, so thus we'd be able to fit more jobs in a smaller space.
So when you look at industrial development typically goes from, for warehouse and distribution, from something like 2 or 3 employees per acre. Mini storage is way below that. There's, lots of acres per employee. And when you're looking at manufacturing, 6 employees per acre, 8 employees per acre, sometimes up to 10. Occasionally, it's certainly higher than that. It depends on the type of industrial you're looking at. So industrial employment is just generally speaking a less dense employment type than commercial. And when you look at the kind of strip commercial like we have here in Scappoose, those employment densities tend to be, for some of the retail, 15 employees per acre, 25 employees per acre, that kind of thing. When you're talking about office and you're still saying mostly one story, maybe there's some two story, 25 employees per acre tends to be more common. So it's a rough average. Should we be looking at growing more commercial employment than industrial employment because it's a more efficient use of land? Well, they're really different types of uses, and they're supportive of each other. So a lot of your commercial uses, many of them are locally supporting. So your grocery stores, your restaurants, that kind of thing. Things like medical services, maybe let's suppose for a moment that Scappoose had a hospital, which, maybe people would travel from St. Helens to Scappoose for that hospital, but a lot of the medical services are locally serving. And then you look at what are the opportunities for economic growth that wouldn't be locally serving, that would be export industries. And those tend to be manufacturing type industries. And so that's why it's important to look at a balance between a certain amount of industrial development and a certain amount of commercial development. Does that make some sense to you?
Yeah, but is that balanced? That's what I'm asking with the future employment land need.
Yeah, it's pretty balanced.
Is it balanced by the density, employment density, or is it, how is it, what's the balance point?
When you look at the number of new employees that we're talking about a little more employment in retail and office and commercial services than we are in industrial. In all communities, do you have that much industrial employment, 31%? No, but Scappoose has a different set of opportunities and a different land base than most of our communities. So in other words, if you don't have land for it to happen, it's really hard for the types of industrial that we're talking about here in Scappoose to possibly happen. And Scappoose has a lot more land in industrial zone for industrial uses and designated for industrial uses than we're looking at. So there are certainly the opportunities. And then there's what's the economic development policy? At this point, the policies are for supporting, I think, industrial uses, things like higher wage jobs, that kind of thing. So we're looking at more industrial than you necessarily would get in some communities, in part because of your land base and in part because of your economic development policies and things like the OMEC. It's really supportive of more industrial growth. So does that help?
Yeah, I think it's a good discussion to have for sure.
Yes.
Especially when you're saying that a lot of industrial jobs will be going away in 20 years. You had said, this was in your packet here that I read, versus when you say commercials, it's office and it could be high tech, for instance, so.
A lot of high tech is industrial. It's located in industrial spaces. Things like chip fabrication, that kind of thing.
If you're making chips, right? But I mean, programmers or whatever.
Programmers, those tend to be office. So yeah, you've got a point that we're looking at an inflection point in the U.S. of greater automation, which we've of course been looking at for the last, I don't know, 20, 30, 40 years. And what's going to be automated. And I would contend, at least in part, that Scappoose is in a better position than other communities not to have your manufacturing as automated away as some communities, because you've got the manufacturing and R&D at the OMIC and at the training for it at PCC. So you're going to have access to a more trained labor force, which is attractive as businesses consider where they're going to locate. So I think that manufacturing jobs will also continue changing as they have been. So more things like 3D printing and that kind of technology, as well as other technologies. It is a little bit aspirational. It is not. I consider these things. Does it meet the red face test? Does it seem reasonable? is another way to put it. And it is, in my opinion, not an unreasonable aspiration, but it seems to fit with where the community's been going. And I think that there is, you know, potentially a policy discussion about, is that where the community wants to continue going?
Kim?
Yeah, for this analysis and discussion, on page 28, you kind of provide the caveat that if a large employer comes in, obviously, you know, these projections are skewed and off. And I may have missed it in here, but do we have like a definition of kind of what that large employer category would be? Is it certain number of employees and up, or?
Tim, can I answer your question in a few moments when I go through the next step of this? Because I think I can answer it, and I can answer it and give a little more context.
Okay, and then the follow on, if folks can think, is, you know, then how does that apply to some of the discussions that are happening today in terms of businesses that we're trying to attract
Mhm.
and the land that I believe is now for sale by the airport, right? Like, are we on the cusp of potentially attracting a business like that as we're going through this exercise?
And I don't know.
Others
But I
might be
can
able to
tell you
answer
why
that.
Papoose is well set for that. Better set than it might be. So this is the next slide I wanted to get to. So here, we'll come back to commercial in a few moments. But here we're looking at land demand for industrial of about 141 acres. You've got a supply of about 443 acres. So you've got a surplus of about 300 acres. A lot of that is out towards the airport. And most of that isn't in the PUA, which is the least useful part of the airport for just general industrial, light industrial type development. So what is a big employer? A big employer, it could be a lot of jobs. Well, we're forecasting 973 new jobs for industrial, 2,000 jobs overall. I would say in the context of that, a big employer, is it 100 people? Maybe. Is it 1,000 people? Well, certainly. And it's also a matter of site sizes. Are they looking at doing what's happened in Woodburn? They're not going to do what's happened in Woodburn here, but a big Amazon warehouse and distribution facility. You guys aren't on I-5, so that's not going to be your opportunity. But that's certainly a big employer and a big site. You guys happen to have those kind of big sites. You're in the wrong place for warehouse and distribution, but it's a good, you know, picture in your head. So are you on the cusp of that? I don't think I'm best positioned to answer that question. It's your people who are actively having discussions with businesses that might come here. But you're certainly in a position so that if that happens in the next 5 years, you know, the next 3 years, the next 5 years, the next 10 years, then you've got time to you know, plan again. So this isn't meant to be do this once and don't come back to it. So you should be coming back to your economic opportunities analysis as you have about every decade or so. If you had a big employer who needed 300 acres, then boy, you should be coming back much sooner than that. That seems improbable. But maybe, I mean, it could happen. Does that help?
Yeah, it is. But I don't know, who would we, Paul, do you know, like, are we actively courting businesses to come to that airport industrial area? And would any of them potentially fall within the category? I just raised this because my concern is, you know, are we potentially setting ourselves up to kind of have the numbers skewed very quickly just because of some activity that's already.
If you do, pat yourself on the back. I mean, cheer, and then come back and do some more planning.
We're talking.
Well, if you could speak into the microphone, that'd be
We're
great.
talking with probably 6 companies right now, ranging from 20 acres to 250 acres. Ranging from, they tend to be in sort of groupings, strata, 25 to 50 employees, 80 to 160 employees, and one, which is aviation related, that is 1,200 employees. Those are I would hesitate to use the word live. They are alive. They're active projects. We're working with Business Oregon on right now. And we obviously focus on manufacturing. We tend to not target or even respond to RFIs for businesses that are where there are height restriction issues, where there is a heavy water need, or where we know what our limitations are right now, and for a reasonable construction period of 2 to 3 years, 10 million gallons a day isn't realistic in 2 years, 3 years. 100 megawatts of power isn't realistic in 2 to 3 years. So we don't pursue and don't even really respond to a lot of opportunities that are that resource intense. Those tend to be a lot higher employment. The one manufacturer we're talking to that's at about 1,200. I'm in love with this project. It's aviation related. It's very cutting edge, extremely well funded, and a higher employment per acre density than any other company we've ever talked with, and very low water usage. They need water for their bathrooms and for the kitchens. And so we don't have strict rules on who we talk to. We have practical rules on who we talk to, but they range from typically in about the 15 to 35 ish, and then 80 to 160, and then above that. We have an interesting situation here where, aside from the port property, most of the industrial land in this county is privately held. And so we can have best practices, but we don't control the decisions over who the property owner will talk to or will pursue either. We haven't had any big conflicts, but we've raised concerns and that sort of thing at times. But we overall we have a pretty collaborative relationship countywide with the property owners. But it's an interesting challenge for probably 90% of the land to be privately held, and yet we're marketing it. I sort of went a little bit afield on that, but did I answer your question?
Yeah, it's helpful. I mean, I think for me, it gives me a sense that, these numbers, the employment numbers and then the available land could change significantly during the course of this process, which is exciting, but it's going to be dynamic.
And if it changed, well, we're still in the middle of the process. You change the analysis. It seems, Paul, I'm going to say a thing, and somebody like Paul is optimistic and good optimism. Somebody like me, a little pessimistic, and I'm also looking at, who knows what the economy is going to do in 2023. And so we have the ability to pivot here. Scappoose has enough land, which is pretty unusual, that there is some time, even if Paul lands, this really exciting sounding to me aviation related company. Let's also posit that it doesn't pollute much. That's fantastic. And let's say that it needs a lot of land. Well, Scappoose can pivot at that point, and start working on a different sort of analysis.
Paul, what are the obstacles of these 6 companies to coming here?
There's no easy answer.
Maybe top 3. Top 3.
In general, as I mentioned, I mean, we do get targeted by site selectors and folks who want to bring someone here that we don't think is realistic in terms of power supply development and water and wastewater and that sort of thing. I would call the resource and the energy challenges good governors as opposed to obstacles. Obstacles. Proximity to I-5, perceived location. People love to talk about being on the I-5 corridor and Wilsonville and Sherwood. I like to point out that it takes you longer to get to Sherwood on I-5 than it does to get to Scappoose and St. Helens on Highway 30 most times of the day. But there's still transportation related. People want to be on I-5. Workforce is raised a lot. We have great stats, and we work with Greater Portland Inc. helps us a lot with stats. So does Colpack. In terms of the mobility, and you see it cited in this report, in terms of the mobility and the distance that people will travel in our region for work. It is not unusual for someone in Longview to work in St. Helens or Vernonia. So we try to be pretty holistic that way. The site selectors tend to be a little fixated on density of housing and population right around within 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes and mass transit. So there might be a perception about housing. We think it's a lot more about population and workforce proximity in 2 to 5 mile 2 to 5 mile range. But honestly, we don't lose a lot of projects in Oregon to other Oregon sites. We lose projects to other states that pungle up $5 and $10 and $35 million incentive packages. And so that's just not how Oregon plays the game. That's not how we play the game. We try to make sure people know we don't play hide the football on that. We say, we can help you with this and we can help you with that. But if you're shopping for incentives, you're not going to find it here. So don't waste your time and don't waste ours. So typically we will lose to other states. And it tends to be economic, tends to be financial.
So I heard the top 3 obstacles were the I-5 corridor not being on the I-5 corridor.
Right.
Housing to match the jobs.
Housing can be one, yeah.
And then the last one are incentives.
Yep.
So one of the concerns I had with this report was the industrial jobs growth versus our housing supply and trying to match those up. Because that's what I've heard too from the bigger companies. They need places for their employees to live. And that's what I've heard about Scappoose from some of the bigger companies looking in the industrial land is that there's not middle income housing to supply for all of our jobs. So anyway, that's something I think we should look at, Beth.
Sure. And I would say also, part of your problem when you talk about housing is enough land for housing, and that's actually a pretty big problem. And land for multifamily housing is certainly an issue, which I'm going to touch on here in a few moments. But as we do the 50-year work, let's say we've got the EOA about right for the amount of growth we're talking about. And let's say the H&A, which is based on the forecast that it's based on, is too low a growth. And so we've established urban reserves. And the city looks at doing a new housing needs analysis, I don't know, 5 to 7 years from now. And it finds that it has a deficit based on a newer forecast because Scappoose is growing, with employment. Then we've got urban reserves set up so that, the city does its housing needs analysis. It figures out that it needs a UGB expansion for housing, and it can accommodate that housing in areas that we designated for urban reserves here. The UGB expansion is, I'm not going to say easy because no UGB expansion is easy, but it's easier. But we don't have our choices at this point aren't increase the forecast of land for housing. It's decrease the forecast of land for employment uses. And to a certain degree, you've got the land base for industrial employment. To a certain degree, that part of it just doesn't matter as much. Yeah, maybe we're overly optimistic on industrial development because of housing, and until we get some more balance there on housing pieces, then maybe it doesn't happen as fast. But you haven't lost anything by forecasting more industrial growth, essentially. So that is my opinion, at least.
Right.
One question, just trying to understand this urban reserve thing, because it's all very new to me. So I've never really dealt with it before. So if I understand you correctly, the urban reserve lands, which will be part of this process further down the road, not
Yeah.
today, it makes it easier to get it into the UGB later. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. I was wondering, I was trying to figure out what the benefits were. And so is that the primary benefit? Are there any other benefits, or is that the primary benefit?
I'm going to say that's one of two primary benefits. The other benefit is as you're doing planning for new infrastructure, for new water and wastewater, you know where you're going to go over the next 50 years. So if you're putting I don't know, a 10-inch pipe out next to the UGB where there's an urban reserves, maybe you decide it's not going to be a 10-inch pipe, but a 20-inch pipe. And that increases the price of that to some degree, but it saves money down the line. You don't have to dig up that pipe and replace it.
So this might be a policy issue that you guys can't answer, but there's commercial land up and down there's commercial land up and down the highway corridor, both in and outside of the UGB. So traditionally, developers are stuck with the cost of running water and sewer lines to their sites. Would this trigger a potential increase in cost for that developer where he would have to pay for a 20-inch line when he would normally only have to pay for a 10? Or would the city use SDCs or something to offset the difference so that his costs wouldn't? In other words, I don't want to do something that will create the opposite effect that we're looking for, which is development, by increasing the burden to development for today with the idea that we're going to get development 30 or 40 years from now somewhere else.
I mean, the common sense answer is that it shouldn't increase the price to the developer, but I'm not sure that that's the common sense answer, the actual answer.
That's a great question. I mean, I think it is a policy decision, you know. I guess it would depend if it's showing up in our master plans, or if it's in a separate sort of UGB urban reserve infrastructure report.
Because if
But it's
in our master plan, my understanding is that developer would then be
Yeah,
forced to
correct.
pay for the larger pipe,
right.
which would then
No, Brian, I wouldn't necessarily assume that. I mean, that I would bring that up as a policy discussion
Mhm.
that we need to have in
Mhm.
the urban reserves, because
Okay.
that seems to be a fixable issue.
Yeah, I mean, I would think the way you would fix it is you'd allow the developer to use his SDC credit bill
Right, to
to
upside
pay for the upsize and not
difference.
stick him with
Correct.
that cost.
Correct.
But I would want it as part of the discussion at least.
Yeah,
Okay, thank you.
yeah, that's a good point.
That's
So-
something to make note of because that's one of the reasons why we're doing this plan 50 years out is if we do put a sewer pipe in, we want it to accommodate future growth and not be smaller than future growth will allow. So that's why we're doing this.
I
So
don't want to stop current growth,
exactly.
doing something for 50 years out. So that would be a request on mine, is that the developer would be allowed to use SDCs for their project for the upsizing of the pipe above and beyond what would be considered normal for their project.
Mhm.
How about when we get into that part, we have some discussion with the city manager's office
Mhm.
and with engineering to see if that's even a likely issue.
Mhm.
Because there's part of the comprehensive plan that we're updating, and then there's part of it that I'm not qualified to update. I'm not an engineer. But we can certainly make recommendations. I mean, I could easily see a comprehensive plan policy about in economic development around proactive planning from the future, but don't charge the current development for that.
And like I said, you could do it through an offset through allowing them to use their
Sure.
SDCs to cover that
Mhm.
cost. So it wouldn't be money out of the city's coffers,
Mhm.
but it would not increase the cost of development for the developer, and then the city would still get the benefit of the property taxes and et cetera off the new development. Seems like a fair thing.
Mhm.
So I'm going to move us on in the discussion unless anybody else has any other immediate questions. Otherwise, we won't get to the policy discussion.
I just have one more add to the urban reserves. I would think it would be a tool for Paul if there were urban reserves to an employment company that wants to come in and employ a lot of people, that we do have urban reserves that we could apply to put into the urban growth boundary. So it could be a tool for attracting employers as well.
You have to be a little careful with that just because oftentimes employers want something to happen, now or yesterday. And even a fast urban growth boundary expansion is not super speedy. But it could be if they're buying a property that's next to the edge of town and it's near an urban reserve and there's agreement with the property owners, it could be a boon for future expansion. Yeah. Just don't want to promise things that we don't have.
Absolutely. Thank you, Beth. Go ahead and carry on.
Okay, and so then hopping over to commercial, we've got in the land supply piece of this, we've got 31 acres in the commercial land supply. And the first star is that the housing needs analysis assumes that 40% of employment land for commercial is available for housing only. So that's not 6 minus, that's 60%. A typo there, I apologize. 60% is available for commercial. And then the second star is that we've assumed that 80% of the airport business park is for industrial and 20% will be for commercial. And the reason that we assume that, I'm going to hop over here to our buildable lands map. Where the airport business park is located is of course, near the airport, but it's not near Highway 30. It's not really near where we think you're going to have a bunch of housing growth. And so, what is that going to develop with? It's not going to develop with the same sort of commercial that you'd get along Highway 30. Probably develop. Let's pause it for a moment. That there's a lot more industrial employment over by the airport and all of that. So that's developing out. Your commercial there is probably going to develop with services for that industrial, and maybe if there's some nearby housing, maybe some for that. But it's not the same as commercial land here along Highway 30. And so I just don't want to. It would seem to me to overpromise that all of that, or even a lot of that airport business park, is equivalent to commercial that's along Highway 30. So with that assumption, we're seeing a small deficit of 21 acres for commercial land. I expect, and this is me not having read the housing needs analysis, but I expect out of the housing needs analysis that there's a deficit of land for high density housing. And I believe when we talked about it before, there was. And so there's a policy question about, do we try to designate more land for housing in the A1 zone? That's the high density zone. Or do we continue to assume that more housing will occur in commercial? So we're putting, this 21 acres together with whatever the deficit is in the housing needs analysis. And then there's the question of what are the deficits or what are the needs related to other needs, parkland needs, churches, et cetera. And I don't have any of that in my head right now because we haven't gotten that far. I'm waiting on some information before I can get there. So I usually the way I think about it is you don't want a lot of commercial land out on the fringes at the edge of your town. I think Scappoose, with its small amount of commercial land and the way that housing is happening in commercial land, I think it's just a little bit different there. So that is why I'm speaking as much as anybody to Brian about why we're looking at the airport business park, some of it developing with commercial uses, and a lot of it developing for industrial type uses.
I 100% agree that there's no way that's all going to go commercial. The magic number is kind of hard to know what it would be. When we did the initial 2015 study, we projected that there'd be a hotel out at the airport. We projected there'd be restaurants and there would be kind of, strip mall, for lack of a better word, with various business service things. That primarily that area was going to be primarily to service the development at the airport. And that was run of what that work was, and that's why that zoning was created. I think that 20% might be a little low. but I don't think that it's, like maybe 35 or something like that. But there will be demand for those things. When we initially did our study, we figured long-term that Scappoose would have 2 hotel motels. And the idea was one that would be out at the airport and then one that would be on Highway 30. That's just one example. With the idea that the one at the airport would be primarily for business-related people for all the industrial. So it would be more, reflecting the development at the airport. And I 100% agree also that you're not going to have a tremendous amount of commercial development there to service the general population of the
Mhm.
town. It's going to be places for lunch, for airport business. I do think that 20% is kind of low, but I can't tell you the magic number.
So what I'd also say is that the land that would be left at the airport business park, um, it's not like it's going to develop, I'm guessing, I could be wrong, but it's not like it's going to develop necessarily all those 30 acres over the next 20 years. Maybe, 10 acres of that develop or 5 acres of that develop. And maybe your hotel, comes in that time, or maybe it comes sometime a little bit later. As the airport builds out. So I don't think that land is unavailable for commercial development long term. This is essentially trying to balance a little bit of, we think that some of that land may well develop with commercial over this planning period. But we think that there's also commercial land demand beyond that.
Yeah,
The airport business park isn't a substitute necessarily for other commercial.
No, not for every.
So that's how we're balancing that out.
Okay.
We don't have the middle school land in this, right? For commercial, are the schools out?
Are you talking about new land need for schools?
No, I'm talking about commercial, the middle school site. That's not considered a commercial site, is it?
Is it a vacant site, or does it have the
No,
existing?
it
middle
has
school?
the existing
No.
No, it's
school on it.
not. It's
No, it
not
has
in
not.
the,
Okay. That's a great commercial site if it was ever available.
And so if the school district hasn't identified it as surplus at this point, then I wouldn't recommend including it as commercial at this point. And frankly, if the school district owns it already and they need a new school, and they're not using that middle school, that's a pretty good site for doing that if they choose.
Did anyone else have any questions? Okay, carry on.
All right. And so heading over to the target industries. These are the target industries that we discussed before. Your manufacturing, especially anything that OMIC is promoting, and any other fishes that Paul's able to reel in. Professional, scientific, technical services, that would certainly include your software engineering. It could include, say, an economics consulting business, or an architect, or lawyers, or I don't know, biomedical research. Could include quite a lot. So things related to tourism, your hotels, your restaurants, your specialty retail. Those are also important for residents, especially your restaurants and your specialty retail. But then also looking at your financial services, your childcare, your personal services. Aviation related services, certainly an opportunity here. And trade industries, such as for construction or manufacturing support. So those are the target industries we're looking at. And it's important to look at the target industries so that we understand what reasonable site needs might be. The kind of thing, the 1,200 employee business that Paula is talking about is not your typical site need. It's a great thing to land, and I'm glad to hear that there's discussion of it. But it's not your typical site need. Did you have anything to add about these target industries, Brittany?
Um, no, not beyond. We'll touch on it with competitive advantages with OMIC as well, and how OMIC plays into these. Curious, Paul, if you're seeing these industries in pipeline reports. This looks and feels right.
Yes, I think so. I mean, they're relatively general. Certainly, manufacturing is our strongest sector in the county. OMIC doesn't give us any reason to want to run away from manufacturing. But also manufacturing goes all the way into textiles and not metal related or not technical related stuff. So this makes all the sense in the world to me. Even starts kind of getting into some of the secondary and tertiary employment around the heavy. Well, I don't want to say heavier because we don't have heavy, but the larger industrial interests.
Yeah, with your trade industries. Yeah.
Mhm.
So then if we're approximately right here, then obviously we're looking at sites for industrial uses and at the airport. And you've got your small scale manufacturing, your business incubator, businesses that locate in an existing building. So they're not building something new. Your mid-sized manufacturing sites. I guess we've also skipped the small manufacturing sites. Maybe you have some demand for like 1 to 2 acre sort of sites. Maybe those locate in existing buildings. But your mid-sized manufacturing sites, 5 to 15 acres. What we hear from Business Oregon is that a lot of the businesses that they hear from are often looking for sites that are, up to 15 acres, maybe 25 acres, but the number of 50 acre and 100 acre sites, especially once you're talking away from warehouse and distribution, those are just rarer. They're not as common as they were a decade and longer ago. So we're looking at those kind of sites. Well, Scappoose has those. You've got more of the large sites, but again, I mean, I caution you about breaking up your large sites too much, but sometimes breaking off small pieces of large sites may make sense. So don't fragment your land base too much because it's easier to have development on a big site than to aggregate lots of little sites into big sites. In commercial, it's really similar, except a lot of the time you've got, space in existing building with multiple businesses, space in a building dominated by one business, sometimes land constructed for new buildings, so your hotels. Oftentimes they're looking for a few acres or 5 acres of site or of land or new strip mall or a new office building or something like that, or adaptive reuse of your middle school, for instance, for an arts center. Pardon me, I'll go off my little dreams. And so you're not looking for big sites for commercial a lot of the time, unless you're looking at a new commercial center, and a new commercial center is going to be its own difficult thing. Oftentimes also, small sites maybe in a newly developing neighborhood, especially if you have any areas that are big enough to, do master planning for housing. You might need an acre or two for a coffee shop and that kind of thing. I don't want to promise you new grocery stores. Those are a little hard to come by. So not saying you can't have one, they're just hard to come by. So what we're saying is your land base suits this pretty well, except commercial. You don't have enough commercial land. And then we'd head off to economic development policies. So are there any questions that anybody has about any of this or about the EOA? And Brittany would pull up the EOA for me because I don't have it in front of me. So I wanted to save some trees. And I don't know if anybody online has questions about the EOA.
Is Highway 30 corridor, is that it's a benefit for the commercial activities, right? Being on Highway 30?
It's mostly a benefit. I mean, there's the, congestion, and that's not fun, but I certainly, in my opinion, you're much better off than if you weren't on Highway 30.
Okay, yeah, because coming from the county, we have south of the UGB along Highway 30, between Highway 30 and the railroad track. those probably, there's no sewer or water. There's a lot of businesses that want to relocate there, but they're limited by, wells and septic systems. And Lori, I'm sure you're aware of one developer who's really, really ready to expand right at at the county line.
And those have to be areas that we're looking at for the UGB expansion areas.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the one right at the county line, he's in our zoning, it's just not matching it. And it's just like, he's developing everywhere except where he wants to.
And
So, I mean, I know it'd be expensive, but for the county wise, it's not a good use for the county properties because they're small pieces of land, but they're adjacent to the railroad track and to the highway. And it would just be, I mean, I don't know, you would have to extend the water and sewer, but I was thinking maybe with the urban reserves and stuff like that, that would be one area.
And so I don't want to promise anything because there's a whole priority scheme. And it's complicated. But yeah, it makes sense. I mean, that's got to be part of the area we're looking in because we have to look at least a half mile, all around the city, and a little further for certain types of uses. So I expect that kind of thing will float to the top in some of this analysis. The city's smart for thinking about that. Yeah. Are there any other questions or comments on the economic opportunities analysis report?
Brian?
Just one thing off your comment. I think the commercial on the highway is great, and it's definitely an attractive location, but access to a traffic light is huge. So if there isn't going to be an access to a traffic light, ODOT may have an issue with it if it's not already in the UGB, and the developer will have issue because it will be limiting for development. So,
And so
so just something for future. I know we're not really there at that phase of this process right now, but the traffic light access on the highway it doesn't have to be a direct access, but it has to be somehow, some way is helpful for future, if we're trying to figure out where we're going to put our urban reserve. I mean, I know there's long-term plans for additional lights on the highway, and we would probably want to try to coordinate those location of those lights be combined with our urban reserves, because that's going to give us entry points that would facilitate the movement of that traffic.
And what I would say is once you have your urban reserve set, then the next time you're looking at your transportation system plan, especially if you have changed your UGB, then of course the TSP, transportation system plan, should look at where there would be intersections in the future.
I guess what I'm saying is that there's already, Lori, maybe you can answer this better than I can, but there's already been kind of a long-term plan for a couple more lights on the highway down at opposite ends of town.
Yeah, and if it's outside of our urban growth boundary, we can't show it in our TSP. So that might be something that Deborah,
Okay.
county planner, might know what's kind of long-term being looked at.
And when you talk about the kind of costs we're talking about with a UGB expansion and expansion of water and wastewater, traffic lights are expensive and intersections are expensive, but they're less expensive than some of the other stuff.
It's not the cost.
Okay.
It's ODOT's willingness to allow them.
Correct.
Okay. Fair point.
That's
Okay.
That's the issue.
Okay. All right. I understand
So
better
think
now.
of them as a mountain. Somehow you have to climb over.
It's human capital cost.
Okay. All right. I get the
So
human
I
capital
guess what I'm
cost.
saying we might even want to invite ODOT at some point into this process, or not, if it's going to cause more problems than it creates benefit. But ODOT is going to have strong opinions on what we can and can't do as far as lights on the highway.
Yeah.
And they are good. And so if we can have all these great ideas, but if they're like, there's no light going there.
Well, and I would say too, it might be, I mean, I understand where you're coming from, that it would be a good idea to coordinate early on that, but
But I don't know if
outside
the
of a
mountain helps.
TSP project, they're probably not going to be able to say anything about that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are there other comments about the economic opportunities analysis?
Anything online? NJ, anyone online? Okay. So let's get into the policies.
Okay, so what I'd say is we'll be finalizing that analysis. Anything that's, missing in it, we'll be making sure to add it. I expect the city would be looking at least noticing intention to adopt, assuming that the city council and planning commission are on board, of course, sometime in 2023. So that report, essentially, once we finalized it, it's there for use in planning around urban reserves. And there'll be a piece that we add to it. We'll add the 50-year forecast to it, which we just haven't done yet. So the economic development policies, I'm just going to run through these quickly, and then I'm going to hand the discussion over to Brittany, whose name I can't remember.
Okay.
And how about I take over your computer at that point, so I'll take notes.
I've got some notes here. Sorry.
Oh, okay. All right. So at some point here in the spring, we're going to be looking at your economic development policies. And we'll be revising them. At least I think so. Here are the goals in the economic development plan, and these are changeable. But I thought some of these were pretty good goals. So about maintaining your conditions that are favorable for growth, healthy, stable, and diversified business and industrial climate. Your local control over your economic development policy through adoption of your EOA, which is a good one to do still, even though this is a new EOA. Providing land and public facilities necessary to support economic development. Take advantage of economic opportunities identified in your EOA. Capitalize on your comparative advantages. So what these goals are for, and we can revise them, and we may well suggest revisions based in part on this conversation. These goals are to set essentially the framework for your economic development policies in your comprehensive plan. And remember that comprehensive plans focus more on things that are land use and may focus on things that aren't land use. But I'd also make the point that things like workforce development, that kind of thing, I'm not sure that they have as much impact in a land use document. But again, some of our discussion tonight may well end up as some recommendations in the EOA as well. So I think you've got a good framework to begin, and I think there'll be some work to do on revising your economic development policies and maybe the economic development goals. We're in a good place. So I was hoping to we'll step through the comparative advantages briefly, and then to talk about what policies we should be looking at, and that'll help us begin to formulate this, and we'll bring these policies back for more discussion. Brittany, take it away.
All right. Thank you, Beth. So you have seen these before, but we added some more context to them in the EOA. So I wanted to share a bit of that now. So OMIC is front and center. These aren't listed in any order of priority, but we're also listing OMIC first because it is of such great importance. So OMIC R&D and PCC together, we know that they're working to cultivate the next generation of talent to support manufacturing and see that expand in the city. And it's hugely exciting for the city and for the state for that matter. We know that between PCC and OMIC, they're both nimble, responsive, and proactive with business and industry needs, and they're hungry to continue that work. We see Highway 30 as a competitive advantage, which we just touched on. It connects your city to the broader region, provides opportunity for freight, and it also intersects with I-5, which is clearly the preferred trucking route for between California and Washington. Proximity to Portland is an advantage. We know that local employers will have access to labor throughout the region. Individuals don't much care what jurisdictional boundary they live in. They care more about amenities and access to different things. Being 40 minutes from the city is an advantage, and it does offer these workers options to live in or near Scappoose, but also have options for urban amenities. The city, we heard through some stakeholder engagement, is has very strong leadership, and they're very responsive, especially with the business community. Thank you, Lori, and your team for your work with that. I find that to be unique in the region compared to some other cities I've worked with. Regional partnerships are also incredibly strong. Paul and his team coordinates and aligns with Greater Portland Inc., the Regional Economic Development Agency he mentioned, as well as your Economic Development District, the Chambers of Commerce, as well as statewide organizations like the Technology Association of Oregon and OEDA, the Professional Development Association. So these partners are really critical for advancing economic vitality and attracting new investment to the region. This is, as we talked about in the last meeting, economic development is a team sport. It cannot be done by one entity, and Paul's leadership is important in that. Employment land, we touched on a lot tonight, so we can move through that. But having land in a variety of sizes, especially with some of these larger sites, really does position the city well for some of these big unicorn projects, as we like to call them. Infrastructure to support business growth. The city has comparatively lower property taxes. It has an urban renewal district with funds that are dedicated to supporting business expansion. And the Columbia Economic Team supports established businesses while especially companies that are pursuing expansion, and the newly formed SBDC connects with local and maybe younger businesses that are looking to link with statewide resources that are, and they're supporting with business advising, business plan development, access to capital, a number of services which are really important. The next one. So the railroad we see as an advantage. It actively carries freight through the city. It also takes freight off Highway 30, so it helps with congestion in that way. The port is reliant on the railroad. We see really high quality of life. We're going to talk about in some of the policies. But your
Question on the rail.
Sure.
Has anyone looked at the ability like for area liver and rails or not, or
There's been, excuse me, there's been interest, even recently interest. And it is feasible in, I would say, not all the way to the Commerce Center, which is on the kind of northeast side of the airport, but partially there. For that reason alone, we also kind of vet out companies that are rail dependent for that property. But the property that is right across, for example, I think it's around Zellerbach, the Parker property all the way over to Omic, that is feasible for rail. But to take it all the way into the developed Commerce Center, cost wise and engineering wise and planning wise, really just not. We have rail access properties that we prefer to steer people to. Sorry, that was a long answer.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah. So the high quality of life, the city does offer residents this small town character while providing easy access to the city, as well as regional outdoor recreational opportunities. There's a number of events. All of you know this. So we don't need to belabor this too much, but again, we'll get into it with the policies. So let's go ahead and do that. So we thought about this piece as really a discussion. This is our interpretation of the competitive advantages, our interpretation of where the city is compared to the current economic development policies. This is pulling from a number of conversations and research that we've been doing that's really organized into these three buckets. And I'll say three because we can all only remember three things. In fact, Paul and I were at a statewide conference a couple weeks ago, and the keynote during one of the lunches was a TED Talk coach, and she said, "Don't give anybody more than 3 things." So now it's stuck in me. So your 3 are to celebrate quality of place, expand business development, and support upward economic mobility. These can shift, and I would love your feedback on it. We'll continue talking about this, but thinking about active voice, action-oriented goals. We think that these policies can be organized as such. So we'll start with celebrate quality of place. I think of this as the city having an opportunity to really enhance and promote the brand of Scappoose. So we know talent, so workforce, have a lot of choices of where to locate. They have a lot of choices of where to live. So Scappoose's job is to tell the story that you want to be told. So what is that story and how are you promoting the city? To be clear and be persistent and to celebrate your competitive advantages. You have many. We just talked about them. I'm sure there are many more. Considering new events, we know that community events really build that community awareness and community pride. But also thinking about what new events may be available. So does the current calendar of events really engage people of all ages, all interest areas? Are they attracting new people to town, new visitors? Who's missing from these conversations? Is the city cross-promoting events with neighbors throughout the county, other neighboring communities? Is there an opportunity to begin an annual awards or celebration of the good work being done throughout the city and, kind of thinking about this as creating your own news? And how to partner on infrastructure development. So I know that a lot of this work is already going on, but it's important to acknowledge that the city is ensuring alignment with public works, with planning, with school districts, and other overlapping jurisdictions to ensure those long-term goals. Some of them we were talking about with SDCs are really being addressed. How might public transportation or active transportation help align with that, and who does the city want to be when it grows up? So the second is a goal or a policy around expanding business development. So continuing to provide that business friendliness and supporting small businesses. So what would that include? Maybe something like interviewing and engaging with small businesses, including those that have recently relocated to the city. What are their pain points? Why did they choose to locate in Scappoose? Why do they stay? How can OMIC and PCC and some of the other players in town really help support their workforce goals? And what amenities does their workforce request? Do they want more services? Do they want more lunch options? Do they want more childcare services? There's a whole host of things there. Certainly continuing to engage with OMIC and PCC, cross-promoting one another's events and showcasing their facilities for community events. How to really use some of that beautiful new space. The third one here is really developing an entrepreneurial ecosystem. So proactively engaging with individuals and entrepreneurs to support what they're doing with business startups, and also engaging with PCC students to learn what the city can do to ensure that they stay. The last thing we want to do is educate our young people and then send them away. So how do we keep them here and continue to recruit more folks here? Bless you.
Excuse me.
Finally, to support upward economic mobility, what does that mean for all people in the city? How do we, as a city, continue to prioritize those family wage jobs? That's what I would see as coordinating with Paul and his team and other economic development partners on outbound marketing efforts. That's going back up to the top of telling that story, telling the Scappoose story. And is Scappoose really active and lively in those business development conversations? Clearly they are with Business Oregon's pipeline, so keeping up with that good work. We talked a bit about automation tonight, but what industries are less vulnerable to automation? How can the city help support those industries? And finally, expanding economic opportunity for all individuals. So connecting with K-12, with PCC, with OMIC, with workforce development, thinking about the whole person, the whole life of a person and their entire learning journey, staying active and present with those partners. So again, your 3. You don't need to think of these details are quality of place, business development, and economic mobility. But that's our first pass, and we'd love some feedback.
So our intention with this, I think, is to include some recommendations in the EOA about things that the city might do. Because, you know, the project stops short of doing a full economic development strategy, but that doesn't mean that we can't include good ideas here. So with that, that's the kind of input I'm hoping you guys will be thinking about through this discussion.
Any questions? I have a question. I think we'll start with Brittany and we'll go to Paul. And three things. So Brittany, what are the top three reasons why economic development is so important for this city?
I don't even want to say if it's so trite, but if you're not growing, you're dying. But we know that as a need, and so to continue to support that growth. I think to stay in the driver's seat of who you want to be, and you want to have that access to outdoor amenities. You want to have continue to have coordination with PCC and OMIC, and so continuing to pursue what you want to be, and you know, ensuring that there are those family wage jobs for your children and grandchildren, and continuing to invest in this community and ensuring that they have opportunities here.
Can I add one on? And
Beth, you can do three as well.
I can't handle three. But one thing that I think is also important is your businesses, they pay taxes, property taxes, and they support what the community is doing otherwise. And so generally speaking, industrial businesses, especially ones that have equipment that are taxed, pay a lot of property taxes. And so that helps balance out some of what Brittany was talking about, you know, the community elements that you want, like your high quality outdoor recreation opportunities, that kind of thing. That's also important.
Same question?
Yep.
Okay.
Top three reasons.
I have to lead with the same thing Brittany said. If you are not growing, you are shrinking, if not dying. And economic development gone about in an orderly and disciplined way helps you choose who you want to help your community be what you want it to be. You can be more intentional rather than having folks show up and decide they want to be in your community. You target and you pursue and you develop criteria of the types of businesses that you want. Example, manufacturing makes sense historically in this county, but it also makes sense because it's got a higher economic multiplier than any other sector. That means more secondary and tertiary and fourth ring jobs and opportunities. I think economic development is also important because it's not just about companies, you know, large companies and large employers. It's also about helping develop an environment, dare I say, ecosystem where self-employed or entrepreneurs or very small business owners are actually earning a living wage themselves, because there is a robust retail and service and commercial community. And I think you need to be intentional about the magnets that help draw and grow those commercial and retail and service opportunities with the secondary and tertiary and quads. So I guess the bottom line for me is to have a better chance to make the place that you want it to be and have the companies that you want to have rather than just have it happen to you. In addition to the tax revenue.
We're just getting down to brass tacks right there.
Thank you. And maybe we could, the analysis, maybe start with that, you know, start with this is why it's so important. because it's incredibly important. And a lot of people don't think it is for several,
Point.
for reasons. So,
So I think what you're saying is modify our introduction to be sharper, and we
Yeah.
can do that.
Exactly. And people assume that they know, but they don't, so it's super, super important.
Point.
Is there are there any other questions?
Comments?
Comments? NJ?
Len?
Yeah, the question about taxes is kind of frustrating because we see Cascade comes here with a second building and they threaten to leave town if we don't give them a tax break. We all basically understand business and say they're not going to leave town. They've got a multi-million-dollar investment, but we don't want to tax because we don't want money for the fire department. We don't want money for the schools. We don't want money for the police departments, and we don't want money for the city. We can't be giving away the process. As Paul talked about, people are talking about $30 and $40 million incentives. We can never do that with our taxes. So why do we play with the nominal amount of money instead of providing that as services? All of those companies, all of those employees, all that housing will require the servicing of the police department, the fire department, the public works, the city. Okay? We need to collect those taxes. We don't need to be giving them away.
Any other questions or comments? Beth, are we getting into next steps? Did you already comment on that?
Is Brittany just so articulate that you guys are like, yeah, write that up?
Right.
I had one other small thing, and I don't know if it's very relevant, but it is a little hole in the report, I think. The land out at Parker's Pit that is pretty much filled is in our UGB, and I did not see it on any of the land inventories for being included. I'm talking about not the entire site, but there's a sizable portion on the south side of the pit. It doesn't matter because I'm sure it's going to come in as light industrial, and we're not trying to add light industrial land. So it's not going to change any of our net numbers, but for an accuracy issue, it may be relevant.
I'm looking here at Lori because I suspect she knows that the site we're talking about, and I'm just wondering if it's got
Ye-
constraints on it.
Yes, it does.
Okay,
Okay,
so that's
constrained for.
it's very constrained, so that's why it's not showing up.
It's currently in the mapped floodplain, so those properties weren't included.
Oh, that isn't.
All right, well, I won't make you guys continue talking. I just want to make sure that if anybody has any, follow-up comments, we'd like to hear more about this, or that, or I disagree with this or that. I just want to make sure you guys have that opportunity to say that. And if you think of something brilliant after this meeting, that's okay. I'm betting that Lori and NJ will take your email. So.
The only thing I would say is that we would like strategies on the economic development. We have ideas here, but strategies, like you said.
And so this
Right.
project only takes us so far here, honestly. It'll take us up to some recommendations, but our scope of work honestly does not include the work to develop those strategies. So that might be something that the city chooses to do as a project after this.
Recommendations would be great.
We will do recommendations.
Okay.
We'll capture the really elegant ways that Brittany said a lot of that.
And could you position them as a strategy?
Well, yeah, maybe they are, but they're not action oriented quite enough to be all of them. So I want to set expectations.
And the only other thing I had said it before, but with the EOA was, I think the job number does sound, to me, it sounds attainable at 2,100 jobs. I think we need the housing to support it, and that's where I'm concerned. But I think the jobs are good. I think our housing is where we have the need.
So how about we add a conclusion that is about a finding that is about jobs housing balance, where once we have the slightly more final EOA H&A, we can add that in and say that may be an issue. It's possibly likely to be an issue over the next 20 years. So.
We want the people to live here if they work here.
Yep. Opportunities to live here and work here.
Great. Are there any other comments? Okay. So I think we are into the next meetings. The City Council Planning Commission check-in is December 5th, 2022. And then our next meeting is January 10th, 2023. So we have the holidays off.
Yes, you do.
Lori, did you want to add anything?
Just a heads up, it's possible that the January date might get pushed back depending on when Beth's able to get the information she needs to do the next part of the analysis, which is the other land needs. So just a heads up about that. We'll give you absolutely as much notice as we can, and hopefully at least a month's notice.
I would imagine that we would know
Do-
here before Thanksgiving.
Okay.
Have a good
Okay.
sense.
Okay, great. So we'll reach out about that ahead, as soon as we can. But that's about it. I just want to thank everyone again for participating. We certainly appreciate it and couldn't do it without you.
And we'll have more meetings for you for 2023. So just in case you're thinking where they're going to be in 2023, the answer is here with you.
And we'll have more questions for you, Beth.
Yeah, excellent. I'm so glad. Thank you.
The vision statement, when do we see that again?
Yeah, we're going to invite Anais to come back in January to recap that and to give you the updated draft vision statement for the 50-year plan.
Wonderful. And thank you everyone for joining tonight and all your hard work. This is a 3-year process. So thank you for your time. And then the meeting, NJ.
Tyler, you came off mute. Do you have something to say?
No, I was just going to say thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome, Tyler. The meeting is adjourned.
Thanks.